Hey there, and welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! Basics. This time we're looking at Exosister, an archetype that finally has the support it really needed to shine. And real quick before we get started, I've now officially spent enough time filming and editing these videos that I am obligated to ask you to like and subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments. Now let's get started. This archetype premiered in the Grand Creators, where the other two archetypes were Punk and the Adventurer cards, so it's been living in a pretty big shadow. Now that Power of the Elements is out, this deck has the two things it needed most: a huge boost to its consistency, and a meta where two of the most competitive decks make use of the graveyard, so you can expect to see a lot more of this deck in the coming format. Exosister is an archetype of Exorcist nuns. Thematically, they are battling and exorcising demons, so their gameplay is all about attacking the graveyard and powering up in response to threats escaping from the graveyard. This is a rank 4 Xyz archetype, with the strategy focused around two main ideas: being able to Xyz someone on your opponent's turn, and generally causing trouble for an opponent that wants to use the graveyard. That last one takes a few different forms, and we'll see those later on. Together, that makes this more of a mid-range or control type strategy, one where you can expect your end-board monster zones to be somewhat sparsely populated. The main deck consists of mostly weak and uninteresting monsters. The original 4 have attack values ranging from 100 to 500, and all of them have only 800 defense. This is compensated for by some fairly powerful spells and traps, as well as a pretty solid lineup of Xyz monsters with a variety of useful effects. The main deck really is built around just getting you into the Xyz monsters. Also, each of the Xyz monsters represents some powered-up version of one of the main deck monsters. As with the release of Power of the Elements, there are now 15 cards: 5 main deck monsters, 5 Xyz monsters, 3 spells, and 2 traps. Now let's look at the cards, starting with the main deck monsters. The original 4 come in pairs, and while this doesn't matter too much for the monster effects, the spells and traps will utilize this to a pretty big advantage. These first 4 all have their own unique effect, plus a shared secondary effect. That shared effect says that when your opponent moves a card out of either graveyard, you can Xyz summon an Exosister from the extra deck using only this card you control as material. Also, after resolution of their unique effect, if you control their partner, you gain 800 life points. This is the only way that the pairing comes into play with the monster effects. It is used to offset the fact that almost all of our spells and traps have a cost of 800 life points. The first pair is Stella and Ellis. On the field, Stella lets you special summon another Exosister monster from the hand, and Ellis can special summon herself from the hand if you already control another Exosister monster. The next pair is Sophia and Irene. Sophia lets you draw a card if you control her and another Exosister monster, and Irene will let you draw one for the cost of placing one Exosister card from your hand on the bottom of the deck. Other than the fact that you don't need another monster to activate Irene's effect, she's a strictly worse version of Sophia. You really only play her because she's a pair with Sophia, and you really want more pairs in the deck for activating your spells and traps. The best main deck monster is Martha, who just came out in Power of the Elements. Her effect says that if you control no monsters or only control Xyz monsters, you can special summon Martha from your hand, and then if you do, special summon an Exosister Ellis from the deck. Be careful though, because this effect does lock you into only special summoning Exosister monsters for the entire turn that you activate it. Here we should point out that the abilities to special summon herself and Ellis are part of the same effect. That means that her own special summon can be negated by something like Ash Blossom, but it also means that the effect to special summon Ellis is insulated from things like Impermanent Veiler. Martha also has a slight variation on that shared effect from earlier, where the other ones would say if your opponent moves a card out of either graveyard, Martha simply says if a card is moved out of either graveyard, so you can trigger this yourself. Although since none of the other ones do this, and the strategy really didn't evolve around moving cards out of the graveyard to trigger it yourself, it'll be pretty rare that you actually end up triggering this yourself, but it is a nice bonus. So now you can see why I called them mostly weak and uninteresting earlier. 4 of them have a shared effect that isn't very good because your opponent has to do something to trigger it, and other than that, all those 4 really have is a clunky way of getting some monsters on board. We can compare this to something like the new Sprite archetype. Martha is actually very similar to Sprite Blue. Within the context of their archetypes, they basically accomplish the same thing, just with different trade-offs and vulnerabilities. But Sprite also have Sprite Jet, who does the same thing as Blue except for a spell or trap. And other than that, all of the main deck sprites have an Ellis-like ability to special summon themselves. Plus, 2 of them act as a quick effect negate. Plus, for being level 2 monsters, they all have better stats than the first 4 Exosisters. Their attacks range from 1000 to 1300. If you're going second and get hit with a barrier statue, normal summoning Martha and entering the battle phase is the only option you have. This isn't necessarily a super fair comparison because we know Sprite is an incredibly strong archetype, but it does go to show that the Exosister main deck monster lineup leaves a lot to be desired for a deck that you would hope to be competitive in 2022. Now let's look at the Xyz monsters to see how big of a payoff this deck has to offer. Like we mentioned earlier, all of the rank 4s thematically represent a powered up version of one of the main deck monsters. Ellis becomes Michaelis, Stella becomes Cass Patel, Sophia becomes Asophiel, and Irene becomes Jabreen. To summarize them quickly, 2 have search effects, effects, 2 have quick effect interruption, 2 have temporary graveyard related floodgates, and 2 have ignition effects that will help you push for game on your turn. Each of the rank 4s is completely generic, requiring only 2 level 4 monsters as material. However, each of them also has an effect that will last only for the turn that they are properly XC summoned using an Exosister as material. Here we see that strategy of wanting to XC summon on the opponent's turn pop up again. To be an effective control strategy, we want these 1 turn long effects to be live on the opponent's turn. Coming up, we'll see more ways that we can actually accomplish that XC summon without having to rely on the shared effect of our main deck monsters. The pairing relationship between the sisters doesn't really carry over to the Xyz monsters outside of the specific type of protection they have. Michaelis and Caspatel cannot be destroyed by battle with a monster who is special summoned from the graveyard, and Asophiel and Jabreen cannot be destroyed by the activated effects of a monster who is special summoned from the graveyard. Now let's look at them individually. First is Michaelis, who has the effect to detach a material to add an Exosister spell or trap from your deck to your hand. Also, the turn that Michaelis is XC summoned using an Exosister as material, you can quick effect target and banish 1 card your opponent controls or is in their graveyard. Next is Caspatel, who, similar to her partner, can detach material to add an Exosister monster from deck to hand. Remember that Martha's effect can activate if you only control Xyz monsters, so if you don't open her but you can make a rank 4, you can go into Caspatel, search Martha, and extend from there. Caspatel's 1 turn long effect happens to be the first of our graveyard floodgates. It reads, if this card is XC summoned using an Exosister monster as material, neither player can special summon monsters from the graveyard for the rest of this turn. Third, we have Asophiel, who has the effect to detach a material to target an opponent's monster and return it to the hand. This is not a quick effect, but it is time for your friendly and definitely not at all related reminder that Game of Seal's effect is not once per turn. Asophiel also has the last of our graveyard floodgates, this time preventing either player from activating card effects in the graveyard until the end of that turn. And finally, we have Jabreen, who can detach material to increase the attack of all Xyz monsters you control until the end of the turn by 800. This is not just monsters you currently control, but all of them until the end of the turn, even if they were summoned after this effect was activated. Her effect that you can only activate the turn she summoned lets you quick effect, target 1 monster your opponent controls, and negate its effects until the end of the turn. Now that we're done with the rank 4s, we've reached the boss monster of the archetype, Exosister's Magnifica. This is a rank 8 Xyz monster who specifically requires 2 rank 4 Exosister monsters as material. It also has the effect that it must be XC summoned with those materials. Its next effect says that it can make a second attack during each battle phase. The next effect is a quick effect to detach 1 material and non-targeting banish 1 card that your opponent controls. And finally, when your opponent activates a card or effect, you can quick effect return 1 of your Xyz monsters attached to it as material to the extra deck. Then you can special summon that monster from your extra deck using Magnifica as material. And this counts as a proper XC summon, which means that whichever of your rank 4s you summon using this effect will have been properly XC summoned with an Exosister as material, so it will gain that special effect that it can only use for 1 turn. What this means is that when you're picking which 2 rank 4s to make to use as material for Magnifica, you have to also think about what effects you're going to need on your opponent's turn. If you just want to have access to a lot of interruption, you can make it using Michaelis and Jabreen. That way you have access to either an extra banish or a negate, whichever one you might end up needing. If you know you're going to want a floodgate, you can make it using Caspatel and Asophiel. Or if you have no idea, you can make it using Michaelis and Caspatel. Make sure to use both of their search effects before summoning Magnifica, and that way you can maximize on your card advantage. This effect is what took the Exosister abilities from a cumbersome gimmick to a somewhat competent strategy, allowing for far more consistent XC summons on the opponent's turn, plus the power to push for game on yours. Combine this with the newest trap that came out alongside Martha, and we have a deck that is fairly easily capable of getting 4 banishes on the opponent's turn. Of course, we will be discussing that combo when we get to that card. That makes this as good a time as any to start talking about the back row. There are 3 spells and 2 traps. However, I think the better way to organize them is by their function. There's 1 quick play spell that is basically the shared effect on the main deck monsters, a trap and a quick play spell that work to get you materials on board for your XC summons, and finally, a trap and a continuous spell that work as extra forms of removal. As mentioned earlier, all of these come with a cost of 800 life points except for the continuous spell. First up is Armament. This is a quick play spell that will let us XC summon an Exosister monster different from the ones we already control, using an Exosister monster we control as material. This does come with a restriction that you can only activate it on your opponent's turn unless they control a monster that was special summoned from the graveyard. Something to be careful about, you have to target the would-be material as cost for the activation, so if your opponent can remove that card from the field before this resolves, you won't get to summon a new monster even if you control other valid materials. This card is also why Magnifica has that restriction that it must be XC summoned with 2 rank 4 Exosister monsters. That's to prevent it from being summoned with Armament. Up next is the material gathering category. Packs is very simple. On a quick play spell, you can add any other Exosister card from your deck to your hand, but it comes with the added bonus that if you added a monster, and the other monster listed on that card's text is either on the field or in the graveyard, then you can special summon the card that you added. Note that if you have Alice on board, there are 2 valid targets that will get you a free special summon. That's because both Stella and Martha mention Alice in their card text. However, if you have Martha on board, there are no valid targets to get the free special summon, because currently no other monsters mention Martha in their card text. Vadis is a trap card that lets you take an Exosister monster from the deck, plus another who is listed in the text of the first one, and special summon them both. This card will lock your extra deck into just Exosister monsters until the end of the turn. Also, during the end phase, the 2 monsters you summoned with it will be returned to the deck. If Armament is the card that helps you get around the restriction on the main deck monster shared effect, Vadis is the card that helps you take full advantage of it as is. The way you want to use this card is to chain it to an opponent's card that's going to move something from one of the graveyards on resolution. That way, by the time their card resolves, you'll have 2 of your main deck monsters on board, each ready to trigger an Xyz summon in response. And finally, we have the removal category. We'll start with Carpe Divum. This one's a bit of an oddball, but it's a continuous spell with a handful of effects. First, it grants a bit more protection to the monsters, this time preventing either player from targeting any Exosister monster with the effects of monsters who were special summoned from the graveyard. Next, on a hard once per turn, when you Xyz summon an Exosister monster, you can name any card, and all of that card's activated effects and effects on field are negated until the end of the turn. And finally, when an attack is declared involving one of your Exosister monsters, you can target and destroy one of your opponent's spells or traps. This card is very situational and honestly not that good, especially in comparison to the other ones, but technically it is a searchable way to deal with Mystic Mine. It can be searched with packs, and if you can find a way to perform an Xyz summon under Mystic Mine, you can use this to negate the effects of Mystic Mine, declare an attack, and then use the other effect to destroy it. And now we're at the last card of the archetype. Returnia comes with the restriction that all monsters you control are Exosister monsters, but immediately you can target and banish one card from your opponent's field or graveyard. Then you get to pick between one of 2 effects. Either immediately perform a standard Xyz summon using materials you control, or if you've already Xyz summoned that turn, you can instead non-targeting banish one card your opponent controls. And this is obviously the card we mentioned earlier that can let us get 4 banishes on the opponent's turn. On your turn, make Michaelis and search Returnia if you have to. Then use Michaelis and any of the other rank 4s to make Magnifica. On your opponent's turn, when they activate a card, you can activate Magnifica's tagout effect. Later in the chain, activate the quick effect banish, detaching whichever rank 4 you used other than Michaelis. That will give you your first banish. Then as the chain resolves, you'll tag out into Michaelis, who will then have her 1 quick effect target and banish. After that, since you've performed a proper Xyz summon that turn, you have access to both banish effects from Returnia. That brings you up to 4 total banishes during a turn, 2 of which don't target, and the other 2 can hit something in the graveyard. And that's it. As of the release of Power of the Elements, that's the entire archetype. Now, before we wrap up with a summary of the strengths and weaknesses of the deck, let's talk about some cards from outside the archetype that you can expect to see played alongside it. First up is Zeus. This is an Xyz archetype, so of course you can expect to see this in the extra deck. With the addition of Martha, this will be less common, but it is still absolutely worth running. Next up is Dimension Shifter. You may have noticed that this deck has exactly 0 built-in graveyard recursion. That is definitely a weakness of the deck, but what it means is that we have access to one of the most powerful hand traps in the game. This is already a strategy that works best against decks that use the graveyard, so leaning into that and including something like Dimension Shifter can lead to a blowout game against a ton of different strategies. We've talked a bit about playing this as a control strategy, so it's worth considering what other floodgates we might be able to play. The most obvious one is Gozen Match. All of the monsters are light attribute, so this won't be a problem at all. We should point out though that the main deck monsters are all spellcasters, and the extra deck monsters are warriors, so we can't play the similar rivalry of the warlords. The Solemn cards are always a good option in any control strategy, in particular Solemn Strike and Solemn Judgment. If we're concerned about protecting our back row cards, Lord of the Heavenly Prison could be a good option. On turn 1, it won't conflict with Martha because it doesn't special summon itself until the next turn, but during that turn it will conflict with Returnia, and you'll have to make sure you special summon it before activating Vadis. Plus, if it's still on the field when it gets to your next turn, it will then conflict with Martha. You might also see people playing a small Magistus package consisting of 3 Zeroa in the main deck and 1 Artemis in the extra deck. What this offers is basically another Stella. Using this effect, you can special summon another level 4 spellcaster from your hand or graveyard, so that can give the deck a tiny bit of recursion and also offer a decent normal summon to not conflict with Martha. And that's most of what you can expect to see played alongside the deck. I know I made a joke about Gamma Seal earlier, but because of Martha's archetype lock, you can't actually use a kaiju in the same turn that you activate her effect. Although that does make something like Sphere Mode a viable option for the deck, because it uses your normal summon instead of a special summon. Now let's talk about what the deck does well. First off, the deck is very simple. It doesn't have a lot of super long or complicated combo lines. It really is super straightforward. Just get to your Xyz monsters and hope that you have enough interruption to stop your opponent. But in spite of that, the deck does have a lot of different ways to get to that end board. As long as you make the right rank 4 first to get the right type of search, and you pay attention to which materials you detach and how that makes packs live with different special summons, most hands will be just fine getting you all the way into Magnifica. Also, the rank 4s have a pretty wide range of really useful effects, and Magnifica's effect basically allowing you to hedge your bets on what you think you'll need on your opponent's turn is incredibly useful. Also, you can almost completely shut off the graveyard graveyard as a resource, which for some decks can basically just end their turn, and for others, it can seriously limit the resource loop and lower their power ceiling. Also, not many decks can set up 4 banishes quite this easily, and when used properly, not many decks can come back from that kind of interruption. That's all nice, but now let's talk about the weaknesses of the deck. First, it is very susceptible to interruption. Having an end board with only one monster makes you incredibly vulnerable. A single kaiju can undo all of the work you did to set that board up. You can technically recover completely on your opponent's turn if you have both Vadis and Returnia, but only if your opponent removes the kaiju for you, and you're almost guaranteed to have to have hard drawn one of those trap cards in your opening hand. Which brings us to our next point, which is that this deck really struggles with maintaining card advantage. 2 of the rank 4s do search something, so at least you can usually get some cards back during your normal combo, but you'll often need to use one of those to extend all the way into Magnifica. In fact, that will often determine which rank 4 you make first, whether you think Pax or another monster would be better for getting into a second rank 4. Pax is great, but it's still card advantage neutral. Vadis is awesome, but slow and fairly easy to play around. Sophia is a +1, but because she can't special summon herself and she's paired with the worst monster, getting her on field is a lot less consistent. Part of this is because it takes 4 main deck monsters to make Magnifica. That's a pretty bad return. But if you use Martha, who's a +1, and you use both Caspatel and Michaelis, each of whom can go +1, then you're only at a -1 for the turn. If you open well and have a way to incorporate Sophia into this play, you can actually come out of the turn card neutral. The problems start to arise when you think about maintaining that advantage. The fact that Magnifica has no real protection, that means that something like a Kaiju or a Raigeki will completely dismantle your board. For your opponent, that means a 1-card trade for 20% of your extra deck and 4 of your main deck monsters. If you do survive to your next turn, you almost certainly at some point used Magnifica's swap out effect to go into either Michaelis or something else. What this means is you're not starting your turn with Magnifica. You then have to expend more resources to get back into Magnifica if you want to try to push for game. If you swapped into Michaelis or Caspatel, you can at least get a search by detaching Magnifica, but if you used one of the other ones, you won't even get that. Over time, you'll also notice that running low on a single monster starts to have compounding effects. This is because the spells and traps, and even Martha, rely on the pairing relationship to generate more advantage. This is even exacerbated by Dimension Shifter. If you're only playing one Irene and on your first turn it gets banished, that just makes Pax a little bit weaker on your next turn, because now you can't use it to get a free special summon of Sophia to then get a free draw 1. This also means that Vadis is completely dead for that pair. Also, if you're playing Pot of Prosperity, an incredible consistency tool for the deck, after your second turn, you will definitely notice yourself running low on rank 4s. All of these problems stem from the fact that each card is completely dead after use. There is 0 graveyard recursion, no graveyard effects, and other than Pax getting a bonus, nothing uses the cards in the graveyard as a resource. We also talked about this earlier, but the main deck monsters are very weak. Only one of them is even able to run over a barrier statue. Also, none of them really do anything if they're left on the field. Their sole purpose is to get you into one of your rank 4s. Compare this again to Sprite. Both Sprite Red and Carrot can special summon themselves, and each of them can also negate one of your opponent's cards. And finally, something that was one of its strengths is also one of its weaknesses. The fact that the deck is very simple means that your opponent can pretty easily pick up on what you're doing and understand your plays. For a deck with a very fragile end board, that can often spell disaster. In fact, if your opponent has Ghost Ogre or Gamma, or really anything that can destroy a monster on your turn, if they hit one of your rank 4s, then there's almost no way that you're actually going to make it into Magnifica. And if you're in a meta where Nibiru is really popular, this deck is really going to suffer. All that said, this deck has what it takes to be a very strong anti-meta pick, but unless it gets more support, it will probably never be a real meta contender on its own. And that's the basics of Exosister. Hopefully you found this helpful. Let me know what you thought in the comments, and let me know what you think of the archetype. I know I was super excited when it first got announced, so I'm really glad that I at least got this last round of support to make it like a fairly competent deck. I've been playing it pretty much since it first came out, played a bunch of different versions of it, like a pure build, played it with a full Magist Ascension, which didn't really go very well. The first video on this channel is actually about playing it with Dogmatica, but my favorite variant was definitely playing it with a small Dynamorphia package. Frenzy is a super fun card, and nobody expects it when you have a Magnifica on board. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Hope you have a nice day.